Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us for Validity Frameworks in Language Assessment and looking at the question of how useful they are for language teachers. A big thank you to our two presenters today. We have Associate Professor Ute Knoch, and she probably needs fairly little introduction in this space because we collaborate with Ute quite a lot, or have done across the years. She's a great supporter of English Australia and the Assessment SIG. But Ute is the director of the Language Testing Research Centre at the University of Melbourne, and her research interests are in the area of policy in language testing and assessing languages for academic as well as for professional purposes. So Ute has published widely with over 40 peer-reviewed publications, and additionally she's the co-author of Scoring Second Language, Spoken and Written Performance, as well as co-author in Fairness, Justice and Language Assessment. And that's with Tim McNamara and Dr. Jason Fan, who's also co-presenting today. She's also co-author with Assessing English for Professional Purposes. And Ute is currently Vice President of the Association for Language Testing and Assessment of Australia and New Zealand. And two fun facts I found out about Ute today when I was doing a little bit of LinkedIn research, that in 2014, Ute was awarded the TOEFL Outstanding Young Scholar Award for recognising her contribution to language assessment. And in 2016, she was awarded a Citation Award for Women in Research. So Dr. Jason Fan, I'll give you some background on him as well. So he's the Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow at the Language Testing and Research Centre at the University of Melbourne. And his research interests are particularly relevant to the session we have today, because they include validity theory and validation of language assessments, as well as agency theory, local testing policy and practice, and research methods. So Dr. Fan is the author of the Development and Validation of Standards in Language Testing, and he's the co-author along with Tim McNamara and Ute in the Fairness, Justice and Language Assessment, which came out in 2019. And he's the co-author of Working Towards a Proficiency Scale of Business English Writing, a mixed methods approach, which came out just last year. Jason Fan is also the second Vice President of Asian Association for Language Assessment, and he's the co-editor alongside John Reid of Studies in Language Testing and Assessment. So thank you very much to both of you, and we're looking forward to your session.
Thank you, Cara, for the introduction. When Cara and Sophie first contacted me about doing a workshop for your conference, and the suggestion came up of doing something on validity frameworks, I was thinking, oh gosh, like, could you think of a more exciting topic? I was really worried that everyone's gonna fall asleep after 10 minutes and hate the session. And when I asked Jason to join us, we discussed for quite a while how to make this topic at least a little bit interesting, because it's really not very sexy stuff here, but I know it's really important. And, it's something that comes up in a lot of readings, and I'm sure those of you working with language assessments in your schools are definitely thinking about this topic. So we thought we'd do our very best to make the session engaging and useful, and I hope that it'll be helpful for your practice. And let us know afterwards if it wasn't. We've got here we go. So we've got the following objectives for the workshop today. We're hoping that at the end of the workshop, you will be able to understand some key concepts underpinning test validity and validation, that you get some idea how the notion of validity has changed historically, because if you have some idea how it changed, it will make it easier to understand what's going on at the moment with our current models. We will hopefully give you some knowledge of a couple of different validity frameworks that are being used in language assessment at the moment. And we'll all together later in the session consider the relevance of these frameworks to classroom-based assessment. We thought one way to make the session a little bit engaging is to, first of all, Jason and I kind of take turns presenting so that you don't need to listen to the same person for a really long time, and also get you involved as much as we can you know, as well in the session, because I know it's late in the day and you've all had long days. So in terms of the overview of what we're doing today, we'll start by thinking a little bit about validity and validation in language assessment and what the differences are. As I already said, we'll quickly talk about the historical changes to the notion of validity, because they're really important and they're quite substantial how our thinking has changed about this. We'll then pause with thinking about validity for a second, and we'll go to classroom-based assessment. My aim here is just for 2 slides, pull out some key features of classroom-based assessment that I think is key for us to evaluating these validity frameworks. So what are the things that are important about classroom-based assessment that I think we need for having in kind of taken care of in a validation framework that works for classroom-based assessment? And I suspect by the end of the day, you'll probably all agree with me that nothing we have at the moment is really very suitable, but that doesn't mean we can't kind of tweak frameworks and so on and think about them a little bit differently. We'll then move on and take turns in looking more carefully at 3 particular frameworks: the socio-cognitive validation framework, the argument-based validation framework, and the assessment use argument. And then we'll move on to the discussion task and just wrap up at the end, thinking more about validation and classroom-based assessment. Okay, so let me get started. Let's think a little bit about validity and validation. To do that, we need to think a little bit about what we actually do in language assessment. So there are a couple of steps. Usually we collect a performance from a student, be it a piece of writing or speaking, or we get them to do, say, a reading task. And then we have some way of evaluating that. And then interpreting that evidence that we can make some claims about our test taker. You know, for example, he's very good at reading academic texts. From that interpretation, we move on to reach a conclusion about the individual. So the conclusion might be this person is ready to enter academic study in higher education in Australia. And you know, we make some decision based on that. They can pass, they can enter higher education. So you can see there's a series of steps involved. And to underpin that, we need to have some sort of model of validation to kind of interrogate all these different steps. So have we done the right thing? Have we drawn the right conclusion about our students? Are we making the right decision about this? Is this person actually ready to enter higher education, for example, or move on to the next class in our course? And really what we're doing here isn't all that different to what doctors do when they collect evidence from different tests and then make some sort of diagnosis with, you know, all the information they have. They say, you know, this is what you have and this is the medication you need to take or whatever. Or what, you know, police do when they're finding evidence about something that's happened. So it's not really that different. So what's the difference between validity and validation? Well, validity is very much a theoretical notion, and it defines the scope and nature of our validation work. On the other hand, validation is the process of developing and evaluating evidence for our proposed score interpretations and use. So about, you know, what are we doing? What are we doing, or what are we saying about students based on their scores, and what decisions are we making, and how are we using the scores? So that's what validation is about, and we'll look at that much more today in detail. So just a very quick historical overview about how the notion of validity has changed. Validity really first came up in the literature on language assessment with one of the first people really who talked or wrote about language assessment altogether, which was Lado. And he said that validity is, does the test measure what it claims to measure? And that's still used quite a lot today, you know, as a sort of shortcut of what validity is. At the time, validity was seen as one of two important aspects of a language test. The other was reliability. And as this concept sort of was further developed, there were three types of validity that were considered important and distinct from each other. There was construct validity, content validity, and criterion validity. And criterion validity was further divided into concurrent validity and predictive validity. So construct validity was examining whether the test measures the kind of skills and abilities that should be measured or that we're intending to measure. Content validity looked at whether the tasks that we set for test takers provide an adequate sample of the domain that we're kind of trying to sample from, say, academic study or academic reading or whatever. And then criterion validity was divided, as I said, into two parts. There was concurrent validity, how the test scores compare with other comparable test scores, so from other similar tests, and predictive validity, how well the test scores predict test takers' performance, say, in the future. So how well will these students do when they enter university, for example? So as a summary of the traditional views of validity, validity was very much considered to be the property of a test. That is, a test itself was considered valid or invalid. And that's very much changed, and we'll talk about that later on. Reliability was seen as distinct from validity, but it was a necessary condition for validity. Test developers were seen to be responsible for validity. Construct validity was just seen as one type of validity amongst others. That's also very much changed, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And validity was often established through correlations with other tests. So I'll now hand over to Jason, who will talk about Messick's work, which really changed our view of validity really substantially.
Thanks, Ute. Yes, as Ute mentioned, Samuel Messick made a very significant contribution to the development of validity theory. So this is a classical definition given by Messick, which has been widely cited by language testing researchers and measurement in educational measurement. So the definition goes, validity is an integrated evaluative judgment of the degree to which empirical evidence and theoretical rationales support the adequacy and appropriateness of inferences and actions based on test scores. So what this definition tells us is when we are evaluating the validity, we are actually evaluating the inferences and actions, test interpretation and use. So here actions refers to test use. And also according to Messick, validity is an integrated evaluative judgment, which means instead of considering validity as consisting of different types, as Ute explained in the previous slide, in Messick's theory, validity is a unitary concept. So we're not talking about different types of validity, we're talking about validity as a unitary concept. So in his theory, construct validity is the unifying factor to which all other aspects, not types, but aspects of validity contribute. I think the most noteworthy contribution that Messick made to validity theory is that he expanded the notion of validity beyond test scores to include relevance, utility, value implications, and social consequences, which I will show you in his very famous validity matrix on the next slide. Ute, next slide, please. Yeah, this is the quite very famous matrix of Messick theory called progressive validity matrix. So it outlines his theory of validity as including two facets, as you can see from the top. On the top, test interpretation and use, along with two types of evidence, evidential basis and consequential basis. So as its name suggests, this is a progressive matrix. So we can take a look at the first block, which is construct validity under test interpretation. And the next block is construct validity plus relevance and utility under test use. That is to say, so this is about whether assessment is meaningful or useful or relevant to a particular context or purpose. Yeah, for example, if an English test, for example, is developed to assess test takers' readiness to study in an English medium instruction university in Australia, for example, if the same test is also used to make immigration decisions, so then we need to really question whether the test is relevant or meaningful for this particular purpose and in this particular context. So this is mainly what relevance and utility is about. So moving on to the next block, which is value implication under test interpretation based on consequential basis. So here the value implication when we're interpreting test scores, so we need to think about the construct and also the theories underlying the construct. Sometimes it also relates to the broader ideologies. So what Messick tells us here very explicitly and importantly is that language testing and indeed educational assessment in general is social and political practice, which is laden with values. Yeah, if you look at the construct, look at the theories underlying the construct and look at the ideologies which give meaning, which give theories, their perspectives and purpose, so they're all value laden. A very important focus in Messick's theory is social consequences. That is the last block in this progressive matrix. That is to say, when we are talking about validation, we should think about the impact of the test, you know, on test takers, on the teachers, what happens in the classrooms, what happens to learning, what happens to families, schools, communities, what is the impact of the test on society. So, Ute, could you please collect next? According to Messick, so there are two threats to validity. One is known as construct underrepresentation. That is to say the tasks fail to capture all important dimensions of the ability or construct that we aim to measure. For example, use an English speaking test as an example. If the speaking test does not include spoken interaction, for example, so we might wonder whether the spoken construct is adequately represented by the tasks in the test. The other threat is known as construct irrelevant variance, which means the test introduces factors that are irrelevant to performance. For example, in the case of an English listening test, if there is a lot of noise from the testing equipment which hinders test takers from performing to the best of their ability, and if the noise is not part of the construct we want to measure, so it becomes a legitimate concern that compromises or threatens the validity of the listening test. This is known as construct irrelevant variance. Next slide, please. As we can see, Messick's theory significantly broadened the scope of validation research. So as mentioned previously, so he has made very significant contribution to test validation theory. However, Messick's theory does not provide validation researchers with clear methodological guidelines. For example, when I conduct a validation study, so how much evidence should I collect? What kind of evidence should I collect? And when should I stop? So Messick's theory does not provide researchers with these clear methodological guidelines. And also, as some scholars argue, Messick's framework also does not provide a very effective mechanism to integrate evidence from evidential and consequential bases into a validity argument. So this is not very clear in Messick's framework. Next, in the handout, we have a table which shows the key changes in the thinking of validity. Next, I'm going to hand over to Ute to talk about validation frameworks, Post-Messick, and also language classroom assessment.
Thanks, Jason. While Jason has just mentioned the handout, I believe you were all sent the handout before the session, but otherwise, Cara, feel free to also put it in the chat for anyone who isn't able to open it very easily. In the handout, we try to just include some of the images and information that we talk about that you might also later need in the breakout rooms when we do our discussion tasks. So feel free to refer to that at any time. So going back to what we're actually talking about, validity and validation. So you can see this historical change from where validity was seen as part of a test itself, and the test developers were kind of in charge of, proving that a test is valid, to this broadened conceptualization where we care about the test, but really we care about how the test is used and what the scores are used for, and what decisions we make about test take and what the consequences are to the test takers in society at large. So it's sort of a moving away from just a narrow look at the test, and with, the discipline kind of really appreciating Messick's theoretical work, which, if your eyes glazed over a bit when Jason presented that, I can really understand that, because it took us all many readings of Messick's work and explanation, and it's not something you can sort of just take in. But if you just understand that our view with, that paper that came out in 1989 really broadened and made us move away from just narrowly looking at the test to thinking about how's the test used, what are the consequences, are the decisions we're making okay? It's a really quite significant broadening. But then the frustration of test researchers, validators, that there wasn't actually a way to sort of easily implement this new thinking. And this is where then what we're going to be looking at next came in. There were validation frameworks put forward that sort of gave researchers and test developers and kind of framework that they could follow when they were doing validation work. Today we will look at 3 of these: a socio-cognitive validation framework put forward by Cyril Weir, and also Barry O'Sullivan was involved in some publications, the argument-based validation framework, and the assessment use argument. It's important to note at this point that they were all developed really for more high stakes contexts. So the first one, the socio-cognitive framework, was developed in the area of language assessment, but it was really for more high stakes once-off kind of assessment, and not at all for classroom-based assessment. The second one, which Jason will talk about, came out of educational assessment in the US and was then brought over to language assessment and significantly expanded by language testing experts, because grappling with language issues is actually quite a different thing than developing a framework that might be used for a maths assessment in, in educational. So we have kind of different problems to grapple with, which makes it really interesting. And then the assessment use argument also came out of language tests, from language testing researchers, but we'll talk about each of these in a minute. So they were all developed for work in high stakes assessment. So to really evaluate whether there's any use in these for classroom-based assessment, I think it's important that we stop for a moment and just think about what are kind of the key features of classroom-based assessment that might be important for when we're doing validation. So I'm going to move over to classroom-based assessment now. And for ease, I've got a slide on formative classroom-based assessment and one on summative. Of course, the distinction is not always that clear, but I'm just using it for sort of ease today in this presentation. So when I think about formative classroom-based assessment, there are a couple of features that I think are quite important. So it's a process in which student understanding is elicited and it's used to adjust learning. It's the evidence is usually matched against some sort of learning target, which should be set out in curriculum or syllabus goals. There's usually some sort of feedback provision included. And ideally, but not always, students and teachers engage with the feedback and the results. And they might be used not only to, for students to learn differently, but also for teachers to maybe adjust how they teach. There's also some sort of cyclical nature to this kind of assessment. It's often not a once-off event. The cycles can be short or medium and long. Just giving a silly example, not even related to language assessment, but my daughter is in primary school and in mathematics, they keep on going back to the topic, say, of division, and they do it in term 1 and they come back to it in term 3, and it sort of keeps on coming up. And we do the same in language assessment. Topics might keep on coming up. The other feature of formative classroom-based assessment is that it can be contingent or it can be planned, and it can vary very much in its degree of spontaneity. I quite like I like this figure here, which sets out, just visually what formative classroom assessment might look like. So there's a formative purpose, which then leads to some sort of eliciting of evidence. The evidence is interpreted against a learning target. And then there's some sort of formative feedback, again, ideally against a learning target, and a formative action. And there's a sort of cyclic cycle to it, or can be. And ideally, there's a formative effect. Again, this is a very perfect world kind of scenario. I think in reality, there might just be parts of it happening. We don't always go through this whole cycle, even if that would be ideal. So that's formative assessment. Let's look at summative assessment as well. Summative course assessments, like those of you working in ELICOS settings, they often involve several tasks, and evidence is often collected over an entire term. So the decision of the final grade or whether someone passes a course doesn't just happen in one, sitting. There's often evidence collected over the whole term. There might be midterm assessments and other types of tasks going on. There's some sort of temporal aspect, so certain types of tasks may be more likely used at certain stages of the term. Part scores may be given for drafts of performances. I don't know, that depends on how you run things. There may be some sort of portfolio type evidence that's collected. Tasks contribute different percentages to an overall course score, maybe. And there's, I'm pretty sure, very explicit linking to learning goals and the curriculum. So these features that I've just mentioned in these two slides are really quite different to what we do in a sort of once-off high-stakes assessment where someone, say, takes the IELTS or the Pearson or the TOEFL test or one of these large scale tests to say enter university. You know, it's quite different. So we need to think about our validation frameworks in light of these really different features. Now, to help you, I've put the dot points on these slides about assessments also in the handout. So now let's move on and look at validation frameworks and language assessments. Pause for a second. And what we'll do is I'll present the first one, the socio-cognitive framework, and then you have a couple of minutes to ask questions if you have any burning questions about that framework, and then Jason will go on to the next one. So the socio-cognitive framework, as I mentioned, comes very much out of language testing. It was developed by Cyril Rea and first published in a book in 2005. So it's a sort of relatively old kind of publication now. And what he did at the time, he put forward this model that you can see here. Now, a couple of things to note. I know you can't read this in detail, and we'll look at these different things a bit more zoom in a minute. But first of all, there are 5 gray boxes that you can see here. And I've put the labels on the left. So he distinguished between context validity, the gray box on the top left, theory-based validity, the box on the top right, scoring validity in the middle, consequential validity on the bottom left, and criterion-related validity on the bottom right. So when you hear that there are these 5 types of validity in this framework, it might remind you a little bit of these 3 types of validity that, you know, we talked about in the historical view of validity. So there's a little bit of that going on, but maybe expanded upon, because consequential validity pops up, for example, which very surely comes out of Messick's work. The other thing to draw your attention to is this 5-box model that I've got up here on the slide is for validating reading tests. There are actually different models for each skill. So the one I've put up here is the one for reading tests, but there's also one for listening, one for speaking, and one for writing. They don't differ a great deal, but there's some little changes to the models. The other thing that I want to draw your attention to is that in his book, he said that the 2 boxes at the top, context validity and theory-based validity, are things that you look at when you're developing the test, that you think about when you're developing the test. And he called it a priori evidence. And that everything at the bottom, the 3 boxes, are a posteriori evidence. So these are things you look at once the test has actually been administered to test takers in some form. So I'm going to now spend a couple of slides looking at these 5 gray boxes in a little bit more detail. So in these boxes, you have lots and lots of dot points. I'll start actually with, oopsie, sorry, the 2 top ones here. I'll zoom into those in a minute. But basically, in the boxes, you have a lot of things that we should consider in a test or after a test has been used. And then in a and in his book, he spends a chapter on each box. And then in a later chapter, much later on at the end of the book, he talks about the kind of evidence we should collect when we're doing validation. So to me, reading the book, it felt almost like an afterthought, like even though he's got a model of validation, but the actual evidence of what we do to validate each of these aspects comes sort of really kind of as an afterthought. So I think that to me was really interesting. So let's have a look at these first 2 areas. So there's context validity, which I've got on the left here. And then for theory-based validity, I've got 2 boxes because one comes from the figure for objectively scored tests, which I've put here in the middle for reading and listening tests. And then one for subjectively scored tests for writing and speaking is on the right. So let's have a quick look at context validity on the left. And I don't want to put you to sleep by going through all these bullet points, but I think it's helpful to think about what is context validity for him. And really, it's all about task design. Like, what does our task that we give to the learner look like? So there's what he calls setting task, and he talks about, is the purpose of the task clear to test takers? What's the response format? Do they need to fill in multiple choice questions, or do they need to write a whole response? Do the test takers know what the criteria are that they're being marked on? What are the time constraints? So really questions of how we develop a task. Setting at the bottom is about the conditions that we're administering the test under and security and things like that. And then on the right of that box, it's all about the linguistic demands of the task. So, is a speaking assessment, is it done face-to-face? Is it done over the computer, over the telephone? What kind of discourse are we eliciting? Or if it's a reading or listening test, what's the inputs that we're giving to learners that they need to read or listen to? That sort of stuff. So if there's an interlocutor, for example, if you have a listening test, how fast are the speakers speaking? What kind of accents do they use? So it's all about what does our task look like. So that's context validity for Weir. Let's move on to theory-based validity. So that is all about what's going on and what are the cognitive processes that test takers use to complete the task. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because these are sort of theories of cognition that he's sort of put into bullet points here in his boxes. And obviously these are different if you're answering a reading or listening test to if you're doing a writing or speaking test. So this is what the boxes are about. And then in his chapter on what evidence do we actually collect to show that our test has context validity or theory-based validity, he lists a whole lot of things, like we're doing a theoretical literature review, a research literature review, a document analysis, needs analysis, and so on. So there's very checklisty. There's lots of things we can look at and collect evidence for. Moving on to scoring validity, which is something we do after the test has been administered. Again, I've got two boxes here. On the left is the box for reading and listening tests, where, they're the usual things we would expect. We do some statistical analyses if the test items are working well and looking at marker reliability, and so on. And on the right-hand side, it's for tests for writing and speaking, and the validity evidence would be to examine our rating scales, establish evidence of rater training and standardization and rater reliability, and so on. So there are not really any great surprises in this. And then just finally, those two boxes at the bottom here, consequential validity and criterion-related validity. Consequential validity, the box on the left, is about examining whether different groups of test takers perform differently on the test. So we also call this bias analysis. So for example, examining whether, males and females answer test items differently, or whether their test has an impact on how language is taught in our classroom or used in the workplace, and whether there are any effects on individuals within society because of the test. So that's consequential validity, and that's very much Messick's influence. And on the right-hand side, we've got criterion-related validity, and that's really comparing our tests with other tests, like very much what was done many years ago as well. And then he lists in his later chapter the kind of analysis we could take. So comparing test scores with other measures, bias analysis, expert judgments, and so on. So that's WIA's framework. So the 5 gray boxes. And I guess the advantage to our earlier types of validity from, Lado's time is that there's much more specific and explicit guidelines for the kind of evidence that we should look for. And it incorporates some of Messick's ideas, but doesn't really seem to add a lot to, what he did. And I guess one issue is that it's not really that easy to operationalize. It's really time consuming and complex to address every element in this model. There's so much going on there, and there's really no guidance on how to prioritize different aspects for different testing contexts. Essentially, I guess it's been criticized as a checklist approach. So, there's some people who really love this framework. I'm personally not a great fan, but this is what WIA's work is. And in later years, there's been, some more elaborations done by also Barry O'Sullivan did some work on this and so on. But this is essentially what it is. So I'll pause here for 2 minutes or so and see if there are any questions about the socio-cognitive framework at all. Just very quickly, you can, don't know what the process is, maybe put up your hands. Sophie, is that how we can run it? And
yeah, sure. And then you can unmute yourself if we select you to
see if
ask
anyone
a
has
question.
just any specific questions about this framework. Or anything else we've said so far. Just a quick pause. Okay, I guess if not, then we'll just move on, and Jason will now talk about argument-based validation.
Yeah, thanks, Ute. The argument-based validation framework advanced by Michael Ken, based in the United States, so represents a more recent, recent development of the validation theory. So this framework has been highly influential in educational measurement, and it also has been widely applied in recent years in language assessment. According to Michael Ken, so to validate a proposed interpretation or use of test scores is to evaluate the rationale for its interpretation and use. So still, when we are looking at validation, we are really looking at test score interpretation and use. And he continued to argue that evidence for validation necessarily depends on the claims being made. So, well, if you have more claims, you have to collect more evidence. If you have more ambitious claims, you have to present more evidence. So validation requires a clear statement of the proposed interpretations and use. In other words, when we are talking about validation, first of all, we need to have a clear statement of our proposed interpretation and use of the test. So how do we want to interpret and test score? How are we going to use test score? So we need a clear statement of that before we develop a validation agenda. Ute, next slide, please. I'm going to use a hypothetical example to illustrate how this framework works. Suppose we have a test taker, Mary, who got a score of 80 on an English proficiency test, developed to evaluate test takers' readiness to study in the EMI University in Australia. So Mary got a score of 80. So according to the test manual, if a test taker gets a score of 80, that means Mary can use the language fluently, accurately, effectively, on a wide range of academic topics. She can read different texts with a high degree of independence. She can understand most audio materials in the university setting, and so forth. So here we're making a claim based on Mary's score of 80 about Mary's language ability. So we are making a claim here of score interpretation. So based on this claim, we can, Ute, could you please connect next? Yeah. So we can make another claim about Mary's ability to deal with language demand in the EMI university academic setting. And we can make, the admissions officer can make a decision to admit Mary into the academic program because of this claim. So here we are making a claim about test use. So if we look at Mary, so if we look at this example, Mary got a score of 80. Mary has the ability to do a series of tasks. So we are making an inference from Mary's test score to Mary's English language proficiency ability. And then we are making another inference from Mary's English language ability to what Mary can do in the target language use domain, that is academic study in the Australian university. So we are making another inference. So what is inference? So inference is basically the logical step that would allow one to conclude that a claim is justified. For example, if we're looking at from test score of 80 to what Mary can do, so we are making a claim of Mary's score interpretation, but we are also making an inference from the score of 80 to Mary's language ability. So in the argument-based approach to validation, as you can see, we are looking at a chain of inferences from a test take score to the decision that is made of this test taker. So in this validation theory, we first of all specify a number of inferences and make a number of claims about test score interpretation and use. So validation basically is about checking whether these inferences are plausible, the extent to which these inferences can be supported, or the strength of these inferences, and also the plausibility of these claims. So in the literature, I have shown you a few inferences in this example from Mary's score to Mary's language ability to what Mary can do in the academic study setting. In the literature, there are other inferences, but here today I'm going to use an inference called evaluation inference to demonstrate how we can evaluate the strengths of this inference and what kind of evidence we can collect to support, to evaluate the strengths of this inference. So the inference I'm going to focus on today is called evaluation inference. So this inference is from a test taker's performance. For example, Mary has finished taking the test, and Mary has got a score of 80. So it's from Mary's test performance to Mary's score. So this inference in argument-based validation theory is called evaluation inference. So let's take a look at how we can evaluate the strengths of this inference. So what kind of evidence we can collect to evaluate the strengths of this inference. So to evaluate this inference, so just recall this inference is from Mary's performance to Mary's score. So the claim we are making here is the score on the test adequately reflect Mary's performance on the test. That is to say, a score of 80 adequately reflects Mary's performance on the test. So to evaluate this claim, we can propose a few assumptions. And then we can collect evidence to interrogate each assumption. For example, the first assumption in this table, for example, is scoring criteria and rubrics capture relevant aspects of performance. So to evaluate, to interrogate this assumption, so we can invite language testing experts or domain experts to review the scoring criteria and rubrics. The second assumption is raters can implement scoring procedures consistently. So to examine this assumption, we can, for example, perform statistical analysis of test scores. The third assumption is administration conditions are clearly articulated and appropriate. So to evaluate this assumption, so we can collect data from students via students' questionnaire, through student interviews, or we can review the administration protocols, or we can conduct interviews with test invigilators to understand whether the conditions are clearly articulated. And the next assumption is instructions and tasks are clear to test takers. So here to interrogate this assumption, again, we can probably collect some data via student questionnaires and interviews and ask them whether the instructions and tasks are clear to them. And finally, we have another assumption is a test is pitched at appropriate difficulty level. And these tasks and items can discriminate consistently between more and less capable students. So to investigate this assumption, so again, we can perform statistical analysis of the test data to understand, to explore whether the test is pitched at appropriate difficulty level. So here I'm showing you a few assumptions and the types of evidence, the evidence that we can collect to interrogate, to investigate each assumption. So after this, we can then decide, we can come to a conclusion whether this evaluation inference can be supported and to what extent this inference is plausible. Ute, could you move up to the next slide? Yeah, for coming back to this figure I showed you previously. So I was showing you how to evaluate this evaluation inference. So other inferences in the framework can be investigated, can be evaluated in a similar fashion. Yeah, Ute, could you please? Yeah. In a handout, so due to time constraint, I'm not going to walk you through all these inferences. So this figure shows you the key inferences in the argument-based validation framework. Yeah, I'm not going to walk you through each of them, but in a handout, we provide a lot of useful resources for those who are interested to learn more about this framework and to understand these inferences in the framework. Yes, Ute, please, next. According to Michael Kahn, well, Michael Kahn compared the chain of inferences to a bridge. According to Michael Kahn, if an inference, one of the inference is broken or cannot be supported, then the whole chain of inferences is at risk, just like the crumbling bridge that I'm showing you in this image. Yeah, next slide, please. As you can see, the argument-based validation approach, I think the clear advantage is practical value. That is to say, it gives researchers with a clear sense, clear guidance on how to implement a validation agenda. So what steps I should follow, in what way should I implement this, my validation agenda. And also it provides a mechanism of evaluating the plausibility of each inference. As I showed you, I used evaluation inference as an example to demonstrate how this inference can be evaluated. Well, some researchers point out that this framework could be challenging, for some validation researchers, because they need to state the basis for test score interpretation at a great level of detail. So as I have shown you about evaluation inference, you have to really show a lot of details and also to show the evidence that you need to collect. And also, according to some other, scholars also criticize it as because it focuses primarily still on the measurement aspects of test validity. I'm pretty sure it's it will take, if you want to get a better sense idea of this framework, it will take you some time to get your head around this framework. Yeah, as mentioned in the handout, we provided some useful references and resources to help you to gain a better understanding of the argument validation framework if you are interested. I think we have a few minutes for questions here.
I think for me, the main take-home message is that there's a series of steps that, as you go through them, you end up with the consequences and decisions of the score use. And this analogy of the bridge, if anything in the beginning, the steps are crumbly, everything that you do with the score later on really doesn't mean anything. If you're measuring badly, or you're not collecting the right information, or, just measuring the wrong thing or not enough of it, all that, if that isn't supported, everything that you do with the score later on, the decisions and the interpretations you make about the test taker, really means nothing. For me, that was always really powerful, and that you need to kind of prove all your bridges along the way are good to really say anything about the important bits at the end. So that kind of helped me understand the framework. And don't worry if it all sounds terribly technical, because it took us years to understand all this and learn it. So that's why I thought Cara was really ambitious when she asked for a 1 hour or 90-minute session on validation. It's just a really hard sort of technical topic, but we're almost there now. So are there any questions, or we can move on? Yep, there's a question by Anuja.
Mm-hmm.
Can you unmute yourself, Anuja? I don't know how to say your name. Yep.
Yeah, thank you so much. My question is, in these steps, where does this test taker stand? Where does the mind frame of the test taker stand?
Do you mean
Isn't that important too in the bridge?
And when you say mind frame, do you mean like what goes on in their heads while they're answering the test?
Yes, how stressed they are, or that
okay, how stressed they are. I don't think that's very well represented in any of our frameworks, because that's a sort of individual difference that we can't really predict regularly with any test. People are different. What goes on in their head in terms of the cognitive processing when they're answering a test task, that is represented in this chain of inferences that Jason showed a bit earlier.
The cognitive ability.
Yeah, what they actually have to do to complete the task, and whether that's sort of relevant to what we're measuring, whether it's actually making them do the kind of things in their head that we want them to do, say to answer a reading test or so on.
Right. Thank you so much.
Anuja, I think this is a very good question, actually, because test taker current frameworks, validation frameworks, well, all of them probably, they're more, I think, from test developers' perspective. Test takers usually, is in the consequential impact, test impact aspect. But it's a very good question. I think a lot of, test taker perspectives should be incorporated. And for example, test takers agency is not really reflected in any of these validation frameworks. And we know that impact is dynamic, and test takers play a very significant role in the testing
how
process.
well the test takers are acquainted with the test, or what preparation they've been given to remain a little stress-free. If they are suddenly put into the test atmosphere without any preparation, without any exposure to the the kind of questions they're going to face, then they're definitely, anyone, even we, would be very stressed. So that's
right.
what came to my mind.
I'm going to actually, I can see there's another hand up, Stephen. I'm going to move on in the interest of time. And if you still have your question later on, we can probably deal with it. I'm just...
No, I'm done. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Sorry, Stephen. We'll get to it later. I'm going to move on to the assessment use argument. In fact, this is going to take less time than the other frameworks, I think, and you will see in a minute why we included this. It's in structure extremely similar to the framework that Jason just showed. It was developed by Lyle Bachman and his colleague Adrian Palmer in the US. They're very, very much language testers, and they were working on this kind of at a similar time as Kane and his colleagues in educational measurement were working on the argument-based framework that Jason just presented, and Lyle and Adrian sort of started bringing some of these ideas into language testing around 2010. Now, I've got a visual representation of the framework here, and you will see it looks really similar. There are boxes that are kind of combined by arrows, and we have similar things going on. We have the test taker's performance at the bottom, then this is turned into a score. We have something about the test taker's ability, the interpretations, really the same what Jason was just showing. Then we have some decisions that we make about the test taker and the consequences. So it's almost identical steps to what Jason was just showing. There's one small difference here is that there are arrows going in two directions. And what Lyle and his colleague argued was that when you're developing an assessment, you should always start with the intended consequences. So you should start by thinking about the consequences that you're intending to have from this assessment, and work your way backwards when you're developing an assessment. So work back all the way from there to what your assessment task looks like. So that's during the development phase. But in the validation phase, where you're more interested in the interpretation and use of what a test taker can do and what the score will be used for, then you start from the assessment task and work your way to consequences. So he's sort of proposing our little bridges we can approach it in two different ways, and that's interesting. But this is not the reason why I'm showing you this framework. The reason actually why I'm showing you this is that a few years later, Lyle and his wife, Barbara, they brought out a book which is called Language Assessment for Classroom Teachers. And the intention of this book was to bring Lyle's assessment use framework into the classroom. So Lyle's wife is a teacher trainer, and I'm pretty sure they sort of talked about it, and I'm guessing she probably challenged him on this lack of, validation frameworks or so on for language teachers, and this is how this book came about. And let's have a little bit of a look at what they did. So here, for example, is the chain of kind of inferences and claims for the development of a diagnostic assessment of speaking. So you can see the bridges there, and they're starting at the top with the intended consequences. So because it's the development, we're moving from consequences down. Students will improve their speaking ability on selected personal and travel-related topics during the course. So it's more about the course assessments as a whole. And then there's a box about the intended decisions. Teachers make appropriate adjustments to teaching, provide feedback to students, create individual learning plans, and students practice aspects of teaching in which they're weak. The next step, the intended interpretation, students' strengths and weaknesses in the speaking ability. So that's what would they, want to find out. And then you're moving back to the actual scores. So there's strengths of weaknesses of individuals, or the outcomes of the assessment recorded on feedback sheets. And then you're moving to actually developing the assessment tasks. So that was their idea, that, when you're developing course assessments, that you start from the consequences and work your way backwards. This is more about larger course assessments, a suite of course assessments. Here's another example. I apologize about the skew printing. I just scanned this out of a book. I don't know if you can ever manage to scan something straight out of a book. I still haven't managed. Anyway, this is about the development of a reading assessment. And again, you've got, you're starting with the consequences, that students will master the aspects of reading comprehension taught in the unit, and you work your way back to the assessment tasks right at the bottom, which is they read a passage and write short answers to questions and so on. So I'm going to skip through. Yeah, so sorry. So if you're validating now this assessment task, you go the other way. With your arrows, you start at the bottom and you work your way up. And just to give you a kind of sense of how this is really similar to what Jason just talked about in the argument-based assessment, they also, in their book, prepare a suite of ideas of what kind of backing you can collect for this kind of different levels in their framework. So, for example, for the consequence, the teacher can talk to teachers of the next level to see how well students are performing. For decisions, the teaching team might monitor the appropriate implementation of passing standards, and students are informed of the passing standards and so on. For the interpretation, the teaching and assessment team examines whether reading assessment is measuring the appropriate skills. If it's covering all the reading skills set for the course, the teachers review the appropriacy of the reading texts for the academic domain or whatever the course is for. For the assessment record, there's a review of the documentation about the consistency of administration of the assessment, the consistency of the scoring, and the consistency of task design. So are there test specifications, for example? So it gives you a kind of sense that it's a really similar idea. You've got different things you need to look at. They're all combined. They build on each other, depending on whether you're developing or whether you're kind of validating something that already exists. The directions of how you think about it might differ, and you collect evidence, to kind of prove that these different claims hold. So wrapping up the assessment use argument, I guess it's a very hands-on practical application of the framework to classroom-based assessment. And the book is nice in that it presents many classroom-based examples. I personally think it's still not really capturing many of the issues of classroom-based assessment that I set out at the beginning of this workshop. And I was really disappointed when this book came out, because there was a bit of a build-up. And then when I got my hands on it, I think it came out in 2018 or something, I was just really disappointed, because I thought we still haven't really managed to capture, the complexity of classroom-based assessment and the sort of things that I think we should be looking at when we're doing validation in this context. But that's my personal evaluation of this. Others might think differently. So I'll very quickly pause and see if there are any questions. Okay, I think it's probably good there are no questions because we're running a bit tight on time. And what we want to do now is to actually get you involved. We'll put you into breakout rooms. And depending on which breakout room you're in, we would like you to think of one of the three breakout rooms, one of the three frameworks that we talked about. So if you're in groups 1 to 4, we'd like you to think about the socio-cognitive framework. If you're in groups 5 to 8, the argument-based validation framework, and in groups 9 to 12, the assessment use argument. And you've got all the, or a lot of the visuals that we gave you in the talk in your handout, so you should be able to remind yourself of what these were about. And we would like you to just briefly consider these 4 questions. So what are the strengths of the framework for classroom-based assessment? And you might say there are none, up to you. What are the weaknesses of the framework for classroom-based assessment? Can the framework be applied to both formative and summative classroom assessments? Remember, I had different bullet points on the slides earlier for these 2 types of assessment, and they're also in the handout. And can you think of some simple modifications to make the framework maybe more applicable to your context that you're working with and the assessments that you use? So I'm going to ask Sophie to put you into the breakout rooms, and this slide will be up in your breakout rooms, I hope. And Jason and I will come in and out of your groups and just see if you have any questions. Or in the interest of time, it would be nice to spend another half an hour discussing this, but in the interest of time, we'll wrap up. Obviously, in your breakout rooms, you talked about, how useful these frameworks are for classroom assessment. And in the sessions that I visited, we spoke about the tensions of, teachers wanting something kind of simple that they can apply, that doesn't kill them, in terms of workload. But at the same time, this tension of classroom assessment being extremely complex. I showed this in my earlier slides, just how many things they're going on. And I think we as researchers working in this area, we haven't really nailed this with coming up with something that's really useful for teachers. What I think we haven't made so clear maybe in our presentations is that Kane, for example, the argument-based approach to validation, they've always said that their model is completely moldable. So you amend it to your context as much as you like. There's nothing fixed in there. The other thing they said is that, you don't focus on absolutely everything and kill yourself with collecting data on all these different bridges. But what you do is identify kind of things that you think might be the weaknesses and focus in on them to see whether there are actually weakenings or not. So, you don't have to do everything. But in terms of going back to my slides, when we teach this topic in our course at Melbourne Uni, we sort of say that we actually think that 2 things that relate to classroom-based assessment, and when we're doing an evaluation, we kind of need to pull them apart. We think that there's a macro level going on where we examine the assessment structure of a course more holistically to see whether the assessments kind of work together to address the learning objectives and how they all relate to each other. And then there's more a micro level where we might focus in on individual assessments, look at individual tasks. And that's where we can use some of these things that we looked at in these frameworks, whether the task is appropriately capturing what we want to measure and whether it's scored appropriately and all these things. But this macro level, this sort of bigger picture view of what are we actually doing in terms of assessment in our course, it's not captured really very well in these frameworks that we looked at. And there might be things when we're looking at the macro level, we might look at whether the assessments in the course are all linked with teaching and work together coherently to achieve the intended purposes, whether the tasks relate well to the course objectives, whether, you know, all the different objectives are measured well, and whether they're appropriate with the relevant standards documents that you might be working with. Teachers may draw on a range of assessment and feedback types over the duration of a course. So we might on purpose have different types of assessment, like peer assessment, self-assessment, you know, all sorts of range of things going on. We ideally want to have assessment tasks that relate a little bit to each other. And we also want that our students are kind of active agents in the assessment process over the course, so that they kind of involved in developing criteria or really understanding the criteria by maybe being involved in peer assessments and so on. So all these kind of things that we value about classroom assessment that are not captured in these frameworks, to me, they're on a sort of macro level that we can maybe pull apart separately a little bit. And then we can focus more on just individual kind of assessments in this kind of micro level, where we look at individual tasks that we might be worried about. You know, if you have a very high stakes kind of assessment at an end of course, you might be particularly worried about, say, your reading assessment, and then you might focus into that and see whether kind of the inferences or some of the weaknesses that you might be worried about, you might focus in on them. But really, to sum up, we haven't nailed this very well in language assessment. We wanted to just give you a bit of a snapshot of what's there at the moment, what we use, and if you come in, you know, across some publications that you've heard these different terms and get some basic idea of, you know, what these look like. And yeah, that's pretty much what we managed to fit into the 90 minutes today. So thank you very much. And we're happy to stay back a couple of minutes for some questions if there are any. Not too long for me, because I've got to play a basketball semi-final in 55 minutes at MSEC, so I'm only giving you a few more minutes. But yeah, are there any questions?
A quick thank you before the questions jump in, Ute and Jason. That was a really valuable session. I know you know, we weren't here for sexy. We were certainly here for the information that you gave us. And I was making notes furiously as it was going through, and we had a great discussion in our breakout room. So, and I hope that was the experience in other people's breakout rooms as well. So thank you very much, both of you. And Sophie, my goodness, thank you so much for all of your behind the scenes work in setting it all up.
Yeah, thank you, Sophie, very much.
Yeah, no, thanks, Jason and Ute, and thanks to Cara and the community of the Assessment Sync for organising today as well.
Mike's got a question.
Let's have it.
Yes, I think the framework that you provided was very interesting, and a lot of the work that you cited came out of ETS with Messick and Kane. And I'm just wondering if you have any advice for dealing with commercial test makers in why they're not doing what they preach, and if we have questions about how the test is being used or how valid are the tests in different formats, we're making high stakes decisions for students. And I'm wondering if you have any advice about how to deal with the organizations to try and get that information, because it seems like it's a closed shop.
Yeah, look, Mike, I agree with you. I mean, I don't know exactly what specific case you're talking about. Like, I think our testing agencies could do a lot better with dealing with various test users and their requests and so on. And I think what you also bringing up is another issue about test validation. It's actually always been a very hot topic, is who's actually responsible for validation and test consequences. You saw earlier in my presentation that, you know, Lado said it was the job of the test developer. That view has also changed, you know, it's not that clear cut, and you can probably find kind of discussions of this in quite a few publications. But I fully agree with you that the test developers, they could do a lot better in a lot of ways. And I think it's quite difficult for us as sort of, you know, normal people to hold them to account, because there isn't really a structure available for us to do that, right? Like if I feel unhappy with what Pearson, IELTS, TOEFL, whoever else is doing, then there isn't a way for me to kind of hold them to account. So that's a problem.
Yeah, I don't know if you want me to get more specific with it or not, but I just find it unconscionable that some tests are offered to millions of students around the world, and they haven't been validated for the purpose that they're using them for. And
I agree, absolutely agree with you. A point that we often make to the test providers, and I think it's also about educating high stakes users, like for example the Department of Home Affairs, that, you know, they have the power to ask questions that we don't. So it's a bit our job to kind of get in there and get them to kind of hold them to account.
Right. I surely am not the first person to notice this, but what's the reaction from the organizations though about that disconnect between this is what we say we do, but actually we don't do it?
Well, I think I guess that's a difficult one to answer. I mean, their prerogative is to make money, I guess.
All right, thank you.
Tricky one. Are there any questions still about classroom-based assessment more, or, you know, in that area? Because I'm going to have to shoot off in a little bit. I don't know if Jason can stay on. David, you've got a question.
Yeah, just looking at the bridges and the bridge that collapses if you don't have all the arches in place. Just trying to reconcile that with what you were saying about in practicality, when you've got limited time, limited resources, just choose the weakest links and focus on those. Just trying to work out how you balance the two, if you could comment on how you balance those two different perspectives.
Jason, do you want to answer?
Yeah, I agree. It's a very flexible framework. So it really depends on your assessment context and also the aspects you want to focus on. As you said, I think I also joined some groups, and you know, colleagues were discussing, you know, we don't have so much resources to, yeah, it's really important to understand, you know, which is our weak link, which one we want to focus on, you know, when you look at the framework and also assess how much resources you have, and then when you are developing a validation plan. I think what Ken wanted to tell us is the framework is flexible, so it can be adjusted, it can be, you know, for your own assessment context, and also depending on, as I mentioned, what you really want to focus on. Yeah, it's quite unlikely for a teacher, for example, to, you know, develop a very comprehensive, you know, validation and validity argument, you know, for assessments that they are using. Yeah, but it's very useful to focus on the weak, to assess your situation and to assess, you know, which inference might be your weak link, and to focus on, yeah, given the resources that you have.
So you look at the bricks in your bridge, you see where they're falling down, you focus on those, and you hope the rest of it comes up.
Hi, thank you, Ute and Jason. It's very interesting. I have a question that I put in the chat already, very briefly. Can you please speak a little bit more about micro-evaluation? So is it what we do moving from claim 1 to claim 2 and claim 3 and so on, like in your presentation, from the intended consequences down to the student's performance on the assessment task, like going through those steps? Or is it about the statistical or content analysis of the assessment to make sure that the assessments are functioning the way they are intended to? Could you please elaborate on that?
I think the two levels, the macro that I talked about and the micro.
Yep. So my question is more about the micro. What do we do in the micro level?
Yeah, I mean, we just suggest following, again, thinking about those steps. I mean, there's a lot of useful things in those steps, but I mean, let's take this typical advantage of a direct entry assessment as an example. And let's just say there's a reading task that has a high score, and we know there's big consequences attached to a student kind of passing this, and they need to get a certain pass mark, to kind of pass that part of the assessment. I think we often work with ELICOS centers on their direct entry assessments. And, if I had to pick out weaknesses that I've seen in a lot of places, I'm not saying at all in your particular institution for those of you who are here, but I've seen this happen and happen again, is that there's a lot of effort put onto kind of mapping, that you're meeting learning objectives and, all your tasks kind of cover what's there. There's much less often effort put, and because often the expertise isn't there in certain centers to write good assessments that are actually reliable and capture enough of the student to really give a good score. So there's often a weakness there. The other weakness that I often see is in decisions, what we call decisions, is about where to set the pass mark. I see often they say, 70%, that's the pass mark. That seems to be this nice round number, which is sort of universally used. But, those are just some examples where I think, I often see these as weaknesses in ELICOS centers assessments. Like, why 70%? Who pulled that number out of the air? And who says that's enough to go to the next level? Or like, why? Interrogate that. And make sure for example, you have a reading assessment and you don't just have 5 questions and say that's enough. That's not going to give you enough information about the test taker. And, when I look more closely at your test items, they're often a little bit dodgy because, it's such a hard thing to write good test items. So, I think stepping back, are often actually places you can say, this is where I would like you to focus on. If you had some resources, maybe don't worry about this bit, but worry about this and another bit, and spend your time on that. That's just an example. You don't have to go through all these steps if you don't have the resources. But it's good to know that they're all there because it makes you think about what the steps are and where you might have your weaknesses.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you for the answer.
You're welcome. Does anyone mind if I go? Because it's semi-finals today and I'm going to be late and my team is going to hate me forever.
No, Ute, let's wrap it up there. Thank you. You've been really generous in staying back and answering those questions. So thanks again, Ute and Jason. Thanks everyone for coming along as well. It's great to see you all.
We should do this longer next time. It's so much fun talking about validity.
See?
See you. Bye.
See you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Bye.